Welcome to the debate. We are diving into really one of the most consequential policy questions facing the United States right now. What are the foundational principles that should govern our technology regulation? We're talking AI, online speech, privacy, competition, the works.
Mm-hmm. And the stakes are, well, enormous. The source material we've been looking at really highlights a fundamental split in ideology. It's basically a choice between two entirely different visions for our digital economy. Are we laser focused on market growth and just innovation speed? Or are we thinking more about creating systemic safety, embedding robust user rights, and, ensuring democratic integrity?
Exactly. And that frames our central question perfectly. Should the regulatory approach prioritize rapid innovation and economic competition using light touch, targeted rules, or should it prioritize comprehensive user rights, systemic safety, and strict accountability through, well, clearer guardrails? I'll be arguing for that innovation-first approach, the one that champions speed, global competitiveness, and individual liberty.
Right. And I'll be arguing that we frankly can't afford to wait. We need comprehensive guardrails now, an approach that emphasizes systemic safety, accountability, and the necessary protection of fundamental human and democratic rights against what is currently unchecked technological power.
Okay, so my core thesis is that the U.S. advantage really stems from its ability to keep the tech ecosystem innovative and free. We absolutely must prioritize global competitiveness, strengthen national security through smart policies, and critically, zealously protect the scope of lawful speech and viewpoint diversity. I mean, establishing some expansive bureaucracy that pre-screens innovation, that risks handing the future to our foreign adversaries. Now, this translates into specific policies. For AI, we need what I'd call innovation-first AI rules, basically light touch, risk-targeted oversight aimed very narrowly at clearly high-risk applications like, say, biosafety or critical national infrastructure. We absolutely must avoid broad mandatory pre-approval or testing requirements that would just stifle startups. Now, this translates into specific policies. On privacy, I advocate for more of a property contract approach.
This baseline gives consumers clear opt-out rights. It mandates data minimization by platforms, and importantly, it targets the real bad actors, those data brokers, with severe penalties. But crucially, this framework preserves targeted advertising models where you have explicit consent and clear opt-out transparency. We shouldn't dismantle a vital economic engine unnecessarily.
See, I come at it from a rather different way. If the goal is truly for technology to serve the public, then clear guardrails are, well, they're prerequisites, not afterthoughts. We need rules that protect individuals, protect children, and protect the foundational integrity of our elections and our economy. On privacy, that property contract model you mentioned, I think it's structurally weak. True accountability, in my view, requires a national baseline of comprehensive data rights, the ability for people to access their data, delete it, ensure portability between platforms, and, this is critical, impose purpose limits on what companies can actually do with the data they collect. Purpose limits mean, basically, data collected for one specific service, like, processing a payment, cannot just be repurposed later for mass behavioral advertising without explicit secondary consent. We need to curb surveillance capitalism as a business model, not just, punish its worst outcomes after the fact. On privacy, that property contract model you mentioned, I think it's structurally weak. True accountability, in my view, requires a national baseline of comprehensive data rights. For AI, we demand AI safety and accountability across all high-impact systems. And that doesn't just mean critical infrastructure. It means health, employment screening, finance, elections. This requires things like mandatory testing, incident reporting, red teaming to discover weaknesses before deployment, and crucially, enforceable liability when models cause foreseeable systematic harm, like algorithmic discrimination, for example. Furthermore, on children's safety, just relying on parental controls, that's insufficient. We need platform design standards, safe defaults, time limits maybe, and a specific platform duty of care when it comes to minors.
Okay, that brings us directly to the heart of the AI debate, doesn't it? The trade-off between speed and that kind of mandated systemic safety. Now, I agree that certain high-stakes domains like Yes, medical devices or power grids require strict, clear liability. Absolutely. But when you mandate mandatory testing and red teaming across every conceivable high-impact system, including potentially all employment tools in every single financial scoring model, you risk creating a catastrophic bureaucratic drag. The problem isn't really the liability itself, it's the timing of the compliance. Imagine a startup using open source models to develop some niche HR tool. They might need months, maybe millions of dollars just to complete government-mandated red teaming reports. This inevitably slows their iteration, it advantages the deep-pocketed incumbents who can afford massive compliance departments, and it could stifle the open source community entirely. We need speed. That's our edge.
That's our edge. That's a compelling argument regarding startups, I grant you that. But I believe the fear that regulation will just freeze innovation is frankly overblown, especially when you compare it to the demonstrable cost of systemic harm. When an AI model is used in finance, say, to underwrite a loan, and it exhibits systemic bias against protected groups, well, that's not a small-scale failure. That's potentially financial ruin on a societal level. That harm is foreseeable, and the developer should be liable. Now, we can solve your startup concern through targeted accommodations. We shouldn't impose the exact same burden on every single firm. We can use regulatory sandboxes for lower risk or novel applications, allowing them to iterate quickly outside of full compliance, at least initially. And crucially, a well-designed, risk-tiered law must include explicit open-source safe harbors and small business accommodations. That way, you focus the burden on the largest deployers, the ones whose models pose the greatest systemic risk. Speed just cannot be the only metric if it comes at the expense of equitable outcomes.
I accept the utility of sandboxes, I do. But I'm still concerned that you fundamentally misunderstand the operational friction this level of regulation creates. Look, we need to leverage market mechanisms wherever possible, which actually transitions perfectly into our privacy discussion. I defend the property contract model precisely because it's pragmatic. It provides real consequences for data brokers and mandates data minimization, making platforms collect only what is strictly necessary for the service. My goal here is to provide consumers with genuine choice via a strong opt-out mechanism, but without destroying the economic foundation of the open internet. Targeted advertising is a massive multi-billion-dollar economic engine. It often supports small businesses, local news. Why impose an opt-in regime that makes that model nearly impossible if we can achieve, say, 90% of the privacy protection through aggressive enforcement against the bad actors and mandated transparency?
Well, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it treats privacy as some kind of fungible commodity, something you can just trade away or opt out of, rather than what I see as a non-fungible right necessary for personal autonomy. The privacy debate is fundamentally about power asymmetry, isn't it? An opt-out mechanism puts the entire burden of enforcement and constant choice onto the individual, who's already constantly bombarded by these complex contracts nobody reads. We need comprehensive rights, including those purpose limits we discussed, so the individual actually regains some measure of control. I mean, look at the state laws like California's or Colorado's. They provide rights of access and deletion, which are key accountability levers. We need that kind of federal baseline. And speaking of a federal law, we really must get specific on implementation. You advocate for preemption and SMB thresholds, so let me ask directly. Which preemption rule would you accept? Are you pushing for ceiling preemption, which would completely wipe out every single state law, potentially leaving a federal floor that's weaker than what some states already have? Or would you support floor preemption, which sets a minimum national standard, but allows states to experiment and innovate with stronger protections if they choose?
I appreciate the push for specificity, and yes, I would insist on clear ceiling preemption. The current patchwork of state laws, CCPA, CPRA, CPA, VCDPA, you name it, it's frankly a nightmare of regulatory whiplash. It forces compliance teams to juggle 5, 6, who knows how many different sets of rules, which disproportionately hurts the very startups trying to scale nationally. We need one unified federal standard to stabilize the market. Now, on the SMB threshold, yes, we need a realistic carve-out that protects small businesses, but the threshold shouldn't just be revenue-based, because that might unfairly penalize a low-margin retailer, for example. It really needs to be tied to a data volume metric, focusing enforcement efforts squarely on companies that process, let's say, over 100,000 consumers' records annually.
That focuses the hammer where the systemic risk actually is.
Okay, that's a clear position, though I still believe that sealing preemption is basically sacrificing consumer protection for corporate convenience. But let's move on to content and speech, where, the integrity of our political discourse is very much at stake. You focus on protecting lawful speech and preventing political bias in moderation. And while viewpoint diversity is crucial, I agree, election integrity demands specific, non-negotiable guardrails that really have to transcend the individual moderation policies of platforms. The complexity here is just the velocity of harm. We need requirements for what I'd call online speech integrity. Things like mandatory political deepfakes labeling, clear disclosure when content is generated by bots, and comprehensive ad repository transparency. If a platform is being used to rapidly disseminate manipulated election-related content, especially in, say, the 120 days before an election, they simply must have a higher duty of care. So how do you reconcile your innovation-first, light-touch approach with that immediate need to combat sophisticated, fast-moving deception?
That's an interesting point, though I think I would frame it differently. The goal, in my view, should be transparency and non-interference, not imposing subjective integrity rules that inevitably invite political mission creep. The perception of political bias in content moderation is itself a major threat to free expression and public trust. Now, if we reform Section 230, it should be surgical. Narrow immunity only when platforms actively amplify illegal content. For instance, paid, targeted advertising for illicit goods or, genuine criminal activity. But we absolutely must maintain immunity for good faith moderation of organic user speech. Regarding deepfakes and election integrity specifically, yes, I support mandatory labeling, but those rules have to be narrow. They must focus on paid political advertisements that utilize demonstrably manipulated content to falsely depict public figures, and they must adhere to strict viewpoint neutrality. The rules should be about provenance. Where did this come from? Not censorship. An ad repository is fine, provided it focuses on the funding source and basic targeting parameters, not allowing external audits that might expose proprietary algorithms or sensitive intellectual property.
But the devil is always in the details of enforcement, right? So, what are your specific rules for political deepfakes and ad transparency in those critical 120 days before an election? What's the necessary labeling timeline? Because we're not talking about taking content down here. We are talking about ensuring the public knows if they are looking at a deepfake or interacting with a bot army.
Okay, the timeline needs to be swift, but it also has to be fair. If the platform has determined through some robust, audible, internal process that the content is indeed a prohibited political deepfake under these narrow rules, then yes, it should be labeled within, say, 24 hours of that determination. But, and this is key, we must avoid automatic takedown power. Lawful, albeit manipulated speech should remain visible, just clearly labeled as such. And look, we can extend this kind of specific duty of care to children's safety too, without needing an entire new regulatory agency. We need clear enforceable rules for platforms regarding minors. Mandatory age verification that respects privacy, that's important, coupled with platform-supported parental controls, allowing parents to actually set time limits and feature access. This is a targeted guardrail, not some system-wide bureaucratic overhaul.
It sounds like we might be closer on specific election integrity measures than I expected, provided those deepfake labeling rules are genuinely enforceable and applied to major viral political content, not just paid ads. And I certainly agree that children's safety requires a specific high duty of care.
Right. So, to summarize my position, the core strength of this innovation-first approach is really about maintaining U.S. competitiveness, securing our national interests, including measures addressing foreign control of platforms, and protecting the full scope of lawful expression. Our regulatory stance is designed to be nimble, targeted, and minimal where market forces or existing liability rules are sufficient. We're essentially building the rails while keeping the engine running at speed.
And my position holds that the core strength of the guardrail approach is the comprehensive protection of individual rights, privacy, data access, financial and health security, and enforcing AI accountability, especially in those high-impact domains. Now, while I acknowledge the risks of overregulation and the need to accommodate open-source projects and small businesses, I believe the greater societal risk lies in allowing unconstrained technological development that systematically erodes individual autonomy and ultimately democratic integrity.
Well, our debate today certainly illuminates the inherent difficulty in designing policy that simultaneously balances, speed against safety and privacy against competition. These are genuine trade-offs. They're not just mere narratives.
Indeed, and the material shows there are areas for potential convergence. Perhaps a risk-based AI law with those SMB accommodations we discussed, maybe a strong federal privacy baseline, and definitely targeted election safeguards. Ultimately, the listener really has to weigh the costs of regulatory speed, potential innovation slowdown, and the entrenchment of incumbents against the cost of systemic, unaddressed harm and what feels like a profound lack of accountability right now.